All right, everybody, welcome to today's Bible study. How are y'all today? Um, so, Brad last week, right? And he got on a roll. He just kept going and going and going. How many chapters? Okay. Well, I'm going to do better than that today. Okay. Um, if Brad can do three, then I can do four. How about that? And y'all don't have anywhere to go today, do you? Y'all okay? Okay. All right. He, he didn't answer any questions? Okay. Yeah. You know, that has been my experience with Brad. He asks a lot of questions. And so, anyway, I was hoping y'all could help train him up a little bit. Well, I do appreciate him doing that for me and grateful for it. So, welcome today. Those of you that are online, welcome as well. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to do Genesis 45, 46, 47, 48, and 49. I'm actually going to do 5 chapters today. And then next week, we're going to do the end of chapter 49 and chapter 50, and we're going to actually end the semester next week. Take a break until January. And in January, we're going to start in Exodus. So if you want to read ahead, that's where we're headed, all right? So today, if you have your outline, you should have gotten that outline. Jen has those, and I think online we have them for you as well. Let's look at our outline for today. Let me just remind you that when the story of Joseph begins back in chapter 37, where he appears on the scene, and he appears originally as a dreamer. Y'all remember that? And so we have finally lived our way, or made our way through Genesis. He's lived long enough to where those dreams have come true. We'll talk a little bit about that today. But his story dominates this part of Genesis and is going to bring the book of Genesis to a conclusion. So let's start in chapter 45 today. And I titled that, Hello, It's Me. I'm not sure if that was appropriate after I thought about it, but I'd already sent it to Jen. But some of y'all don't even know that song anyway, but that's where I got it from. But the point is, finally you get to chapter 45, and look at how the text opens, verse 1. When Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, have everyone leave my presence. So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. So we've reached the point to where all of the tension has reached a climactic point, and Joseph can no longer control himself. He just has to go ahead and share who he is. Now, Brad covered this text before last week, chapter 44. That's the backdrop to chapter 45. And so if you go back for just a second and look at chapter 44, when Joseph had all this silver, and then he had that special cup put in Benjamin's sack. Y'all remember this? And then he sent the people out and said, why have y'all done this? You know, someone has stolen this cup. And then to the older brother's horror, that special chalice is found in Benjamin's sack. Okay? So they rush back to see Joseph, and Joseph confronts them, you know, and he says to them, what have you done after all I've done for you? And then he says something really interesting. He said, don't you think I would know about this, a guy like me? I think I could figure this out without your help. But the backdrop to chapter 45 is Judah's just word to his brother. He didn't know it was his brother because he didn't know who Joseph was. But beginning in verse 16, Judah takes over. And he offers this long plea to Joseph. And he just says, Joseph, or he doesn't call him by that yet. He just says, you can't keep our little brother as a slave. You can't do it. Our father would not survive that. And so he gives him this long explanation. And then finally, Judah gets to the end of chapter 44, and Judah says, just let me be your slave and let my brothers go, particularly let my little brother go. And, well, that is the setting for what happens in chapter 45. Now, why was Joseph doing all that? Why did he keep messing with them? you know? I think the simple answer is just to keep them connected to him. You know, they kept coming back, and he kept doing things that required them to come back. So Joseph is keeping them on a leash, so to speak, so they doesn't lose them. I mean, Egypt is a massive country, and Canaan is a good ways away from where he was, and so he wanted to stay in relationship with them if he could, once he knew who they were. But then you come to this time where he reveals his identity to his brother, and he cries out. And I want you to notice the first thing he says to them. Look at verse 3. He says to his brothers, "I'm Joseph. Is my father still living?" Now, the way that's translated to English doesn't make sense to us because these guys have got through telling him, if we don't bring Benjamin back, our father's going to die. What he was really saying is, how is my father? That was kind of the Hebrew way of asking that question. Is he faring well? And notice how he words the question, my father. Now, the last time he uses that phrase, my father, is when he's naming his children. And he expresses the fact that he has forgotten all that happened to him. And it's a lament, if you will. It's what he expresses earlier when he names his children. Well, now he refers to Jacob as his father. Isn't it interesting in verse 3 what happens to the brothers? They're not able to answer him because they're terrified at his presence. Now, why do we think they're terrified? So, la-ti-da. You know, my mama used to say the chickens have come home to roost. I don't know if y'all say that in Texas or not, but bottom line is he's not the young man they left in a cistern. That's not who he is now. He is Pharaoh's right-hand man. And he has the wherewithal, the authority, the power to do whatever he wants to do. And now they're probably even wondering, what about all this weird money in our sacks and cup in Benjamin's sack? What is going on here? Is this guy messing with us, and what's about to happen to us? So they're terrified because they don't know what to do. So in verse 4, Joseph says, well, come close. Well, when they did, he says, I'm your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt, as if they would forget that. So right off the bat, he just reminds them of exactly what happened. It's kind of a fascinating exchange as Joseph begins sharing, though, from his perspective, kind of what all this really meant. And it's interesting. We're going to come back and talk about this in a minute, but look at verse 8. Joseph said, so it was not you who sent me here, but God. How about that? So Joseph's interpretation, if you will, of what all happened, he puts it in the hand of God. And so then, look at verse 14. This is a very emotional time for him, obviously. Throws his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept. I mean, this is his full brother. They have the same mom and dad. He kissed his brothers. He wept over them, and they all visited together. So there's this powerful, emotional, climactic moment that's been building for a while. The way Moses tells this story, he tells it very intentionally, and I think in a very powerful way. So then Pharaoh hears about it, and Pharaoh loves Joseph, trusts Joseph, wants Joseph to be happy, wants Joseph to be fulfilled in his work. And so he tells him, go and get your family, bring them here. Let them come here, don't worry about it. So, and then he says, look at verse 19. Here's, go down to the U-Haul, tell them I sent you, and they'll give you whatever you need. You don't have to worry about it. It's all yours. Get whatever it's going to take. So Joseph is able to gather up whatever he's got to get, provisions, and he makes sure that they have everything they need and provisions for them for their journey back. And he told them, tell our father, Joseph is still alive, and he's the ruler over all of Egypt. But what's interesting to me is, look at verse 24. Joseph says this, now y'all don't argue on the way. Y'all see that? Now that's an interesting little comment. What would they have argued about, I wonder? Well, they're already starting to think about, what's this really going to be like when we come back? How are we going to be treated? what's Joseph really going to do? And I would even imagine some of them pointing fingers at each other and saying, I told you we shouldn't have sold him in the first place. But it's your idea. You know everything. We always got to do it your way. And now look at us. So Joseph basically tries to pull the air out of that argument and says, let's don't act that way when y'all go. Just go and share the good news. So that's exactly what they do. And then we have the real family reunion. That's where Jacob's family is finally reunited. Isn't it interesting? They form a caravan and they escape, if you will, the atrocities of the Holy Land, and they go to Egypt. It's kind of fascinating, isn't it? I'm standing here in 2023, and there's a whole line of people right now today lined up trying to escape the atrocities of the Holy Land and go to Egypt. As a matter of fact, Joseph and Mary, at one point in their life, escaped the atrocities of the Holy Land and went to Egypt. So this is how many times is this story going to be told before this whole thing's over with? It just happens over and over and over. We begin sentences with, because of all the atrocities and challenges of the Holy Land, comma, this has happened. That has been told over and over and over. And we're still telling it in 2023. It's amazing, isn't it, what's happened. But Jacob and his family get set to go. Now Jacob, he has grown so much in his faith and in his journey. He's a different person than he was when he was the man who fled his brother Esau out of fear for his own life. A lot's happened in Jacob's life. The journey that he was on, the way he dealt with his father-in-law, the way his father-in-law dealt with him, the plan for reconciliation with Esau. There's so many things that have happened to Jacob. But so Jacob, he's the kind of man, he still depends on the wisdom and leadership of God. That's who Jacob is, and that's certainly who he's become. And so look what happens in chapter 46. So Israel, Jacob, set out with all that was his. When he reached Beersheba, he offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. And God spoke to Israel in a vision at night and said, Jacob, Jacob. Here I am, he replied. I am God, the God of your father. Don't be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there, which is what God told Abraham years earlier. And he says, I will go down to Egypt with you, and I will surely bring you back again, and Joseph's own hand will close your eyes. What better thing could you have said to Jacob at this moment in his life? That he's going to be reunited with his son, and that he will have a great nation. He'll die in Egypt, but he will return to Canaan. I mean, that's about as good a news as this man could receive at this point in his life. And so, sure enough, they make their way to Egypt. And then there's a listing of all these folks. And what happened when you read all this and all that Jacob has now, what it reminds us of is that God's kept his promise. He's going to provide for Jacob. And all the bounty that Jacob had, and now the children that Jacob had, the land that Jacob had, and his descendants now have a future. And they're going to survive this famine. So once again, kind of the question that you have all through the patriarchal narratives is, are they going to make it? Are they going to survive? Over and over and over. And I mean, they go down to Egypt, and is Pharaoh going to kill Abraham? Is he going to take Sarah? Same thing happens to Isaac, and then you've got the challenge between Jacob and Esau. Is Esau going to kill Jacob? So you've got constantly woven in, there's a thread, if you will, in this narrative of, are they going to make it? Is it going to work? Are they going to survive? Is the promise going to live? Is the blessing going to go on after these people? And so you still have that because of the threat of this famine. But now God is going to take Jacob, at least during this moment in history, to the land of plenty, which is Egypt, because one of his own sons has provided. So God has used Jacob's own child to provide for his family without Jacob even knowing it or understanding it. And that's exactly what's happened. And so then you have this listing of all these people who are going to go with him. There's a kind of a rounding of a number. There's about 70 of them if you get to chapter 46, verse 27. So Jacob's family makes their way finally into Canaan. And then notice verse 28 of chapter 46. So Jacob sent Judah ahead of him to Joseph to get directions to Goshen. That's where they're going to live. When they arrived in the region of Goshen, Joseph had his chariot made ready, and he went to Goshen to meet his father. And as soon as Joseph appeared before him. Now imagine, Jacob has not seen Joseph in all these years, and he now comes to him not as a young shepherd boy that was sent out to the field to check on his brothers. He's now returning in Pharaoh's chariot. And I'm just imagining he probably didn't travel by himself. What do y'all think? I'm assuming he's second in command in Egypt. Don't y'all think there's an entourage that arrives? There's a Secret Service patrol, with sirens and whatever it was they had in those days. And Jacob looks up, and that's his boy. Of all things, that's his boy, And as soon as Joseph appeared before him, he threw his arms around his father and wept for a long time. And then notice what Jacob says. He says, "I'm ready to go." That's it. I've lived long enough. God's answered my prayers. I've seen for myself that my son that I thought I'd lost is still alive. And so what a word for Jacob. And so once that happens, now they've got to negotiate a relationship with Pharaoh. And that's going to be a little dicey, y'all, at the beginning, because there are a number of scholars who've researched this. There's a group of people known as the Hyksos, Hyksos, in the ancient world, and they were shepherds, and they were enemies of Egypt. And so there seemed to be a certain prejudice against people who lived as shepherds. And so notice the whole challenge of the conversation. When you get to verse 31, Joseph says to his brothers and his father's household, "I'm going to go and speak to Pharaoh, and I'm going to tell him my brothers and my father's household are living in the land of Canaan. They've come here. The men are shepherds. They tend livestock, and they brought along their flocks and herds and everything they own. And when Pharaoh calls you in and asks, 'What's your occupation?' you answer him. 'Your servants have tended livestock from our boyhood on, just as our fathers did, and you'll be allowed to settle in the region of Goshen, for all shepherds are detestable to Egyptians.'" So basically what Joseph is saying is there's no need to lie. Just be honest. This is who we are. This is who you are. But just know these are not the favorite caste of people to Pharaoh and the Egyptians. They view them with great prejudice. Okay? Again, a lot of research has gone into all that. Bottom line is that's exactly what happens. And they talk about how they made their way there. And Pharaoh decides he's going to allow these people to stay. Then you have this very interesting encounter between Jacob and Pharaoh. And I guess the way I would look at it is you got these two patriarchs. Jacob would be the older, as best we can tell. Pharaoh may be more of a contemporary of Joseph, maybe a little older than Joseph. But Pharaoh recognizes that this man is a man of great stature, at least in the world in which he's come from. And Pharaoh recognizes. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because if you compared Jacob's bounty to Pharaoh's bounty, well, that would be no comparison from an earthly perspective. My goodness. Pharaoh's the most powerful man in the world. Jacob is a shepherd. And his boys are all shepherds. Okay? They didn't arrive in Egypt in their own chariots. That's not how it worked. They arrived in borrowed U-Haul trucks, belonged to somebody else. They also came with provisions from Egypt. They came with food from Egypt. They came with money from Egypt. And so it's not like Pharaoh would have looked at Jacob as someone, as a peer from an earthly perspective. But it's very fascinating to me. If you look at verse 5, chapter 47. So Pharaoh says to Joseph, "Your father and your brothers have come to you, and the land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best part of the land. Let them live in Goshen. And if you know of any among them with special ability, put them in charge of my own livestock." We have to take care of these animals, and if you think they're better at it than we are, give them a job. Let them work for me. Then, verse 7, Joseph brought his father, Jacob, in and presented him before Pharaoh. After Jacob blessed Pharaoh, what an interesting line. Now, would we not agree that Pharaoh has already blessed Jacob? I mean, he's sent for him, made provisions for him. He's prepared a place for his family to live. He has promoted his son. I mean, he's been a blessing. Well, that's not what this means, though. Jacob does something different when it says he blessed Pharaoh. After he had blessed Pharaoh, actually, is what it says. Pharaoh then said, "How old are you?" And Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The years of my pilgrimage are 130. So he would qualify as an old man, right? He says, "But the years of my pilgrimage don't equal the years of the pilgrimage of my fathers," referring to how long some of them lived and also how blessed they were. Verse 10, Jacob blessed Pharaoh again and went out from his presence. Twice Jacob blesses Pharaoh. There seems to be, at least in the minds of most scholars when you read that, there's a lot of question about what does that mean. Most scholars believe it means that Jacob placed his hand on Pharaoh and pronounced some kind of spiritual truth over him, and Pharaoh received it. And he did it twice. And so it shows that Pharaoh recognized something about Jacob that was different than himself. And the only explanation for that, it had to be a mysterious spiritual acknowledgement, because that's all it was. There was no transfer of goods. It wasn't like Jacob was going to give him anything. Jacob gave to Pharaoh what Pharaoh could not give to Jacob. And that was a spiritual blessing from a spiritual man who walked with the only true God. So it's a powerful exchange to me of these two patriarchs. And it appears to me that this particular Pharaoh accepted it and recognized it for what it was. It was something he himself knew he didn't have to give to this spiritual giant who was standing in his presence. So very powerful, interesting story. So they get settled, and then you come to the middle of chapter 47, and then Moses, if he's the principal writer, kind of gives us some insight into how Joseph ran Egypt. The famine is getting worse, as the story is told in chapter 47, and people start saying things like, we don't have enough money anymore. Joseph starts taking their livestock. He eventually is going to take all their land on Pharaoh's behalf, and then he comes up with a way to tax them. And Moses stops and says in verse 26, Joseph established a law concerning the land in Egypt. It's still in force today. 1/5 of everything belongs to Pharaoh. So in other words, Moses is saying even in his time of life, hundreds of years later, there was still an acknowledgement of how the Egyptians related to their king. Okay? And that was attributed to Joseph during this famine. But the point is, Joseph had done the work that he needed to do during the 7 fat years so they could survive the 7 lean years. And he was a true blessing to the people of Egypt. Then Moses tells us Jacob is at the end of his life, and Jacob says, now I want to speak blessings, because that was traditional. It was common in their culture whenever someone comes to the end of their life. In fact, I was just in Toronto, Canada, with a group of folks from all over North America. We're helping to establish and launch this new missional movement that we're calling Ascent. One of our leaders, one of our consultants who's been working with us, is a guy named Lee Spitzer. And Lee used to be the executive director, general secretary of the American Baptist Churches, USA. And he's retired, and he's gone to work for us. But he's a Jewish person. He's a convert to Christ as a teenager. He and his wife both. He has a long, very fascinating story of how his family rejected him, and still does, actually. But he's a long-time Baptist leader in New York and New Jersey. But he talked to us about blessing, and he said it's still in their cultural tradition. He said, you wait until you're almost dead, if you get the chance, and when you know that's happening, then you speak words of promise and hope over your family. Lee challenged us to reread the last part of John's gospel as Jesus doing that. Jesus is on the final night of his life, his earthly life, and he said we need to read John 14, 15, 16, 17 as a blessing from Jesus at the end of his life. Very fascinating take from a person who lives in the Jewish culture. But that's what Jacob says, I want to do. It's fascinating where he wants to start, because Joseph wants to make sure that Jacob blesses his 2 boys. So if you look at chapter 48, Joseph was told your father was ill, so he quickly went and got his 2 sons, and he brought them to Jacob. And Jacob realized why Joseph was there, and so he understands that he has a responsibility and a role to bless. And so Jacob blesses the 2 boys. Now, y'all remember how he did it. You know, Manasseh's the older, Ephraim's the younger. And so Joseph knows how this works. So he gets Manasseh and puts him on Jacob's right side. So Jacob would put the right hand of blessing on the older boy, and he puts Ephraim on the left side so that he gets the second blessing as the younger boy. And then, lo and behold, Jacob switches his hands. And Jacob's blind at this point, can't really see. And he switches hands. Now, Joseph shouldn't be shocked by that because Jacob is younger than Esau, and he got the blessing, you know. And so, but regardless, his dad begins speaking the blessing over these 2 boys and basically elevates them to son status, if you will, in terms of being tribes of Israel, in terms of how they're going to be blessed. Well, Joseph, you look at verse 17, he tries to correct his dad, and he saw his father placing his right hand on Ephraim's head, and he was displeased. So he took his dad's hand and moved it to Manasseh's head. And Joseph said to him, Father, you messed up. This is the older boy. This is the younger boy. And Jacob says, basically, you think I don't know that? I know what I'm doing. And this right here is from God, not from me. See, Jacob is not the source of the blessing. He's the steward of the blessing. And if he hadn't learned anything else in his life, he's learned that. And he's doing what God's leading him to do. And so he basically says that to Joseph. This is what's going to happen. Ephraim will be elevated over Manasseh. History will bear that out in some ways. Then you come to chapter 49, and Jacob says, now it's time for me to bless them all. And so he just brings all the boys in, and one by one he pronounces the blessings on his own children. It's fascinating how he does it. You know, when you go back and read through each one of these blessings, scholars, as you might imagine, have dissected every one of them, trying to figure out how was this lived out in the lives of these tribes. And there's a lot of connections to the way the land was divided, the way some of them were scattered. Like he says to Levi, I'm going to scatter you among your brothers. Well, that's exactly what's going to happen to Levi. Levi is going to become the priestly family, and the priestly families won't necessarily get the land. As a tribe, they're going to live all over Israel. But the good news is that means they survive. Because when the northern kingdom is invaded, the southern kingdom has Levites living in the tribes of both Judah and Benjamin. And so there are descendants of Levi who actually do make it through the judgment that took place on the northern, the tribes to the north. But it's interesting, Jacob, when he pronounces these blessings, he also speaks some really straightforward words, if you will. For example, y'all remember what Reuben did? Remember, Reuben tried to go get the blessing before it was actually given, remember? And as some people say in the ancient world, it would have been okay for Reuben to have one of Jacob's wives. That was a customary thing in the ancient world as a part of the blessing. But remember, Reuben decided to go take that on his own. You remember that? So, verse 2 of chapter 49, Jacob says, assemble and listen, sons of Jacob, listen to your father Israel. Reuben, you're my firstborn, my might, the first sign of my strength, excelling in honor and excelling in power. Turbulent as the waters, you will no longer excel, for you went up into your father's bed and onto my couch and defiled it. So the very first word out of the chute is, I remember what you did, and because of that, you're not going to get the full blessing. Interestingly enough, verse 8, Judah. Judah's the one who's going to receive that. So he says, Judah, your brothers will praise you. Your hand will be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons will bow down to you. You are a lion's cub, Judah, and you'll return from the prey, my son. Like a lion, he crouches and lies down like a lioness. Who dares to rouse him? But then here's the prophetic messianic word to Judah that's going to be lived out through David and ultimately through Jesus. The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he to whom it belongs shall come, and the obedience of the nations shall be his. So there's the prophetic word to Judah. He's going to be the true tribe of promise, and the messianic hope will be lived through Judah. Prophets, years later of Israel, will take this text, and they'll begin to call for the Lion of Judah, looking for who ultimately is going to be the son of David. We'll hear this reiterated in 2 Samuel, and then it'll be fully consummated in the person of Jesus. Okay, you also get verse 22. Obviously, Joseph gets a special blessing, and he receives that. He's a fruitful vine, and that is exactly right. Joseph was a productive person, and he survived the attacks, if you will, of the enemy and of his family. And so he receives a special blessing from Jacob. And a brief word about Benjamin. So the whole thing about blessings, about future, and about hope, some of it has to do with land in this particular passage. Let me just give you 2 or 3 things to consider before we're done today. First, Joseph's dreams come true. However, as I point out in your outline, his rule over his brothers was laced with grace and forgiveness and love. When did he establish himself and his dream came true where his brothers actually realized they had been bowing down before their brother? It's when he had decided to show them how much he loved them and he was forgiving them and he was bestowing grace upon them. So it didn't play out quite like maybe Joseph thought it would, where it was just going to be an expression of power when he was a young boy and he got this dream. Remember, he came and told his brothers, hey guys, y'all are awesome. You're not going to believe our future. One day y'all are all going to bow down to me. It's going to be great. Okay? Well, that wasn't well received then, but it happened, but it didn't happen quite that way. It happened with tears in Joseph's eyes, right? He almost couldn't take it when it happened the first time. And even when you get to chapter 45, Moses says he just couldn't take it anymore. He was too broken. He was filled with too much love, not hate, not power. He was filled with grace and forgiveness. And that's how that dream came true. And it was after a testimony from Judah. That's when it happened. When he listened to Judah, and Judah expressed something that I'm sure Joseph had longed for. Judah expressed love for his brother Benjamin. And he said, I'm not going to leave this boy here. In fact, I'm going to give my life for him. Well, that expression of familial love struck a chord in Joseph. That was something that I know he longed for. And that's what he sought when he restored his relationship with these brothers. And I think that's one of the reasons he said, when y'all go home, don't fight. It's all good. We're going to be okay. Second, there's a word about transcendence. There's actually a big story here. And somehow Joseph knew it. I don't know how Joseph knew it. Only thing I can come up with is it was revealed to him by God. There's a greater plan in force than just what's going on with their family. So if you'll look at chapter 45, verse 5, he says, don't be distressed and don't be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. Somehow God had revealed to Joseph that all of this had happened for a reason, and it was a much bigger reason than a family squabble. And their story was contextualized by the big story, and God's providence was at play that motivated Joseph. It helped him to move forward and move past the pain of their family, which is a powerful story if you think about it. Somehow, Joseph's understanding of the providence of God led him to be able to move his family past the pain of their past. So the cycle of anger and revenge was broken by Joseph. And the path to breaking it was acknowledging the hand of God in his own life and the fact that his life was contextualized by a much bigger story than his own. I think there's something to be learned there, y'all. This family found healing and hope in the providence of God. In other words, the journey in their own family was dwarfed by a much bigger story. And somehow Joseph had figured that out by the time he met his brothers. Aren't we glad? Families sometimes need healing. They need to move past things, and it can be really hard. And sometimes there's got to be something that triggers it. There's got to be something that brings about a greater good, if you will. I would tell you all that the cycle of anger and revenge is hard to break. Right now, we're watching events in Ukraine. We're watching events in Israel. And what do we see over and over? No matter how you view it politically, there's anger and revenge. And revenge breeds more anger, doesn't it? And that anger breeds revenge. And sometimes it takes years to fulfill it. But if you don't end it, it'll raise its ugly head again and again and again. And how many times has that story been told? It happens in families. It happens in communities, happens in nations. And at some point, finding our transcendent hope in who God is, I believe, is who really brings the answer to that. And it's hard to find. Quick word about Jacob. Man, what a story. Jacob, come on, y'all. I mean, Jacob is no longer a young, somewhat deceitful brother on the run. He is a blessed man who can bless Pharaoh. He has come a long way, hasn't he? And it's the hand of God in his life. God knew that about him. God saw it in him. And God has performed a miracle in that man's life. I would also say there's power in blessing. There's something about blessing. There's something about generational relationships being healthy. And so I would say to those of you in this room that are older, you hold power that you don't realize you have. And oftentimes it's the power to grant permission and bless. And whether you realize it or not, there are people in your family and people who live in your spiritual family who are in a different generation than you who need that. They need that gift of permission, and they need the blessing. And sometimes it's hard to hand off a baton. Isn't it? Every gold medal we've lost in the 4x100 Olympics as an American team has been lost in the baton handoff. You ever notice that? We don't lose it because we're slow. But we're fast. And we're faster than all them. But somehow or another, that baton handoff is hard. And I would just say, all of us, as we get older, we have a responsibility to be relationally healthy to those who come along behind us and find ways to grant permission and bless. It's important. And whether the younger generations know it or not or acknowledge it, there's something deep inside of them that longs for it. They want to know it. They want to hear it. They want that hand of blessing that comes from somebody that's gone before them that they respect. It's a powerful tool. These boys right here, they wanted to hear it. Now, some of them heard some harsh words, but at least it was spoken in love by their dad. There's something about that, y'all. There's power in it. And so there's just power and blessing. And God is a God of blessing. It's interesting to me that the Hebrew word barak, B-R-K, are the three consonants. That word's found a lot of times in Genesis. It doesn't surprise me that we get to the end of the book and it's all about that. Because God has blessed Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And he's calling on them to bless those who come along behind them. All right, I'm going to stop right there. Those of you that join us online, thank you. Blessings, and we'll see you next time.